Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. In 2003, before the U.S. invasion of Iraq, there were an estimated 1.2 million Christians living there. Today, that number is less than 250,000, an 80% drop in less than 2 decades. If this trend continues, a religious minority that has been in Iraq for centuries will be gone entirely. A recent article in The Atlantic by reporter Emma Green describes the plight of Iraq's Chaldean Catholic community and the incredible pressure that they have been under since the fall of Saddam. This not only includes ISIS's reign of terror, but day-to-day discrimination against Chaldean Christians that is causing so many to seek to leave the country. Emma Green is a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine covering policy, politics, and religion. We kick off discussing the history of Christianity in Iraq before having a broader conversation about the causes and consequences of the fact that a religious minority is fleeing Iraq in such huge numbers. A key test of a democracy is how it treats its minority communities, and by this metric, the exodus of Christians from Iraq does not augur well for the prospect of democracy in that country. So a quick note before we start this episode. Over the course of 6 years of running this podcast, I have interviewed hundreds of astounding people who have lived absolutely fascinating lives and careers in international affairs. This includes foreign ministers and diplomats, famous academics, journalists, social entrepreneurs, and many more. I have now decided to collect the very best of these interviews and offer them exclusively to premium subscribers. I've already posted several of these excellent interviews for premium subscribers, and each week I'll be posting a couple more. I have about 50 of these in total. I've already posted about 6 or 7 of them exclusively for premium subscribers. I will be rolling out 1 or 2 new episodes every week. To become a premium subscriber and access these episodes chock full of great life and career advice, please follow the link in the description field of this podcast episode. That will take you to a page on Patreon, which is a platform for supporting online content creators like myself. From there, you will unlock the bonus episodes and also other rewards like access to my daily news clips service called Dawn's Digest. This is a news clips service that people who work in global development and humanitarian affairs subscribe to. We serve several major institutions like USAID and the UK House of Commons and many more, and it can be yours complimentary if you become a premium subscriber to the show. You can sign up for your premium subscription by following the links in the description field of this podcast episode, wherever you're listening to it. Just a couple of taps on your smartphone and you will be there. Or you can go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more, or directly to patreon.com/globaldispatches. You would be supporting the show, unlocking great rewards for yourself. Thank you in advance. And now here is my conversation with Emma Green of The Atlantic.
So Christians have been in Iraq since just a few hundred years after Christ. This is a historic population that have been all over Iraq, but heavily concentrated in a region called the Nineveh Plain that's in northern Iraq for literally thousands of years. What was so interesting to me in reporting this story was also learning that they feel their connection to this land, to this place, actually reaches back before before Christianity. So Christianity is their identity, it's their confession, it's their way of forming their communities. Church is at the center of their lives, but they also see themselves as a people, as a nation. And that connection to a national identity reaches back far before Christianity and forms the basis of some of their claims to being the original people of Iraq.
So before we get into sort of the nuts and bolts of your really tremendous piece of journalism in The Atlantic, can we just nerd out a little bit on the religious aspects of Chaldean Christianity in Iraq?
Sure.
I'm a fan of religion. If I wasn't doing this, I'd probably be teaching like comparative religion in some leafy northeastern liberal arts college.
That sounds great.
Yeah, no, it did. I took another turn and started this podcast instead. But so one thing that was really interesting to me that came out in your piece, and you referenced it earlier, is how, unlike, say, mainstream Christianity here in the United States, there's this like almost liturgical connection to the place, to the land. Can you sort of talk about that a little bit? And it seems based on your piece that you probably like attended a Chaldean service there.
I did. Yeah. I traveled in the region and went to several different churches, went to mass there. And one of the things that so struck me that I wanted to convey with my reporting about the Christians in Iraq is that there's something really different about the way they conceptualize who they are and how they know who they are compared to, for example, Protestant Christians in the United States. So I talk about the sort of Protestant mind as we think of it in the US, where there's this conception of the body of believers, wherever they are, that's where church is. It doesn't matter so much where your building is or where you're located geographically. It doesn't matter exactly what country you're in or anything like that, although those things can be important and useful. It's really about sort of this free-floating idea of the church. And for these Christians, for the Chaldean Christian population that I focused on, it really is the opposite. It's this version of religion, of Christianity, that understands itself specifically through a dialect of Aramaic that is very close to what Jesus would have spoken. It's a format of service that has all of these callbacks to ancient ways of doing worship. It's specific patches of land. It's specific buildings that were built hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, that still are important to them. And all of those things collectively make up their identity of what it means to be a Christian person. And I think the reason why this is important, besides the sort of fascinating nature of it and the distinctiveness of it, is that it really opens up this question of what it means to be Chaldean in diaspora, to be part of the Assyrian Church of the East in diaspora, or Syriac Orthodox Church in diaspora. If these are Christians who believe that specifically being in their historic homeland is an essential part of what it means to be a Chaldean Catholic, then who are they when they're living in Detroit? Who are they when they're displaced all over the world to San Diego and Australia and to Europe, where all of their relatives are scattered across the globe? And that's the reality that the population is facing now. We've seen this huge drop-off since the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. Somewhere in, obviously these numbers are kind of rough because census making in Iraq, especially in times of war, is fairly complicated and not necessarily scientific. But the best numbers that we have from reliable sources are somewhere around the 1.2 million range in 2003, now to somewhere around 250,000. So that's an 80% drop in this 16, 17-year time period. And the reality is that most of Iraq's Christians are now living in diaspora. And the question is, who are they now?
How in the years of Saddam were Christians treated?
So just to be clear at the very beginning, obviously Saddam Hussein was no champion of religious liberty and freedom. And in so many different ways, he repressed different religious minority groups, specifically Shia Muslims. Obviously, he extracted a genocidal campaign against Kurds in the north in Iraq. So I don't want to in any way sort of paint the picture of Saddam Hussein as this great bringer of religious freedom. But there is a sense in which, especially for the clergy, for established churches in Iraq, that the Saddam years were ones at least of stability. His regime afforded certain protections to the Christian population. There were highly visible advisors in his government who were themselves Chaldean Christian, which is the most populous group of Christians in Iraq. And so during those years, there was this side effect of the political stability, for whatever it's worth, that Saddam was able to bring that allowed Christians to operate under a sense of at least some kind of security or stability, even if they did not have what we would think of in America as a fully fledged form of freedom where they're totally enfranchised, completely equal to other citizens, and fully able to exercise their religious beliefs sort of fully to the fullest extent of themselves.
But they weren't like specifically targeted in the same way as other religious minorities were. And you mentioned some high-profile members of his inner circle, Tariq Aziz being one of them. He was
exactly
sort of like the Western face of the Saddam regime.
Exactly.
In sort of the worst of his era, and he was the foreign minister for a long time.
Exactly.
Can you, I know in your piece you talk about the plight of one town during ISIS's expansion in, was it 2014-ish? Mm-hmm. Could you sort of talk about the sort of Chaldean Christian experience in Iraq during that ISIS era and sort of what happened to that town?
Yeah. So during the summer of 2014, ISIS begins its push across the Nineveh plain, going from Mosul across the east towards the town that I focused on, which is called Kramlis, which is some distance from Erbil, the capital in the Kurdish region in the north. So it's sort of in between Mosul and Erbil. You could think of it if you're looking at a map. And what I heard from listening to stories from clergy, members of the town, aid workers who worked with the population there is essentially they were on guard all summer waiting to see whether ISIS was going to push further. And they thought they were safe and had been assured by security forces that they were in fact going to be safe. And then there was an evening in early August when all of a sudden security forces are leaving the area. They realized that ISIS is coming down the highway and they had literally hours to evacuate from the town. So the story that I told was about this priest who is essentially like the center heartbeat of this town, who rang the giant bell that's in the middle of town, trying to reach all of the people who live there, get them out in time. They were able to pack up their cars. Some of them set out on foot, move towards Erbil, that Kurdish capital. There were a few people who got left behind, but actually ISIS did let them go sort of miraculously. And they end up with very little supply, very little sense of what's going to happen, displaced in Erbil. The community I focused on was stuck in a half-finished apartment building that didn't even have all of its walls put into place yet. And they were sharing this space with hundreds of other people from other towns on different floors. And they started to realize that this wasn't just going to be 24 hours of ISIS occupying their town or 24 days of ISIS occupying their town, that they were really there for the long haul. So this became a long-term, many, many months long displacement for these Christians. Many of them were in Erbil. Some of them were displaced to other towns that are near that region. And it wasn't until finally security forces were able to beat back ISIS ultimately to the Battle of Mosul, which was sort of the culmination of the effort to push ISIS out of that area of Iraq, that these people were able to even imagine possibly going home. But the real focus of my piece sort of using this dramatic and horrible story as the center is the fact that ISIS was not the beginning of their troubles, and ISIS has not been the end of their troubles. There are all sorts of conditions on the ground in Iraq for these Christians that make it very hard in a day-to-day way, even before ISIS, to move freely, to feel secure, to feel confident that they can be Christian and be safe. And in the wake of ISIS, there's been an enormous amount of hesitation for people in returning to the Nineveh Plain. One is just the facts on the ground. There has been an enormous effort to do reconstruction and rebuild houses, but people are nervous that they're going to go back to half abandoned neighborhoods, and the demographics of those neighborhoods are changing. They don't know who their neighbors are anymore, but they're also not sure whether there's going to be another ISIS, that the next surge of an extremist force is right down the road.
Can you talk a little bit sort of specifically about how ISIS sort of treated the Christian population? Was it sort of akin to how they approached Yazidis, which was sort of genocidal in its intent, at least when it came to Yazidis?
Yeah. So a couple things. I would say first, there is not a total divorce between the insurgent violence in those years right after the U.S. invasion of Iraq that did at times target Christian individuals and churches and communities, and what came later. As we know, ISIS is sort of this amalgamation or stepchild or, descendant of these other forces that had been brewing in Iraq previously. And so it didn't just rise out of the dust from nowhere and take a completely different form. There were forms of violence that targeted Christian prior to Iraq. But I would say the distinctive thing about ISIS in its treatment of Christians and Yazidis specifically was this calling out, this targeting of these minority populations, which have been in the region for a very, very long time, and trying to essentially eliminate any claim of legitimacy that they might have to the land, and also then to systematically make sure that they're pushed out of the land and that they basically died, that they wouldn't be
genocidal almost.
Yeah. I mean, the United States went back and forth. We remember this big fight in 2015 over whether the State Department was going to declare ISIS's actions a genocide against Christians and Yazidis. And there was a huge community of advocates who felt it was crucial to call it what it was, that this was genocidal intent to specifically remove these particular populations. I would say, my story focused on Christians in part because part of the focus is on that bridge to the United States, and Christians have a huge advocacy community here in the U.S. The Trump administration has focused on their cause for a lot of reasons. So that was one of the reasons I selected them. But it's worth noting that Yazidis had an enormous amount of hardship, and in fact, in certain ways, caught a worse situation than Christians because many of them were taken as slaves into ISIS's camps. Women who were kidnapped, forced to serve ISIS, were raped. All of these situations, that scene that it's burned into my mind at least, on Mount Sinjar, where all of the Yazidis had gone up to the top of this mountain and were basically surrounded by ISIS, and aid groups were trying to drop food to them, and they were stranded, and it wasn't clear what was going to happen to them. I mean, this situation when ISIS came into this territory in northern Iraq was really horrific for these religious minority groups. And I think it's important to hover on that because these are people who have been in this land for a very, very long time. And part of ISIS's MO was to try to delegitimize that, to erase their claim to the land.
And you also detail in your piece how, in this post-ISIS Iraq, there is still institutionalized discrimination against religious minorities, specifically Christian, but also just sort of day-to-day sort of persecution, I suppose, that many Christians feel from, their neighbors or others. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the the sort of tiered level, I suppose, of citizenship that is afforded to Iraqi Christians, and sort of why even now after ISIS, so many are fleeing the country and so many are seeking to live abroad.
So this is, I think, the most crucial part of the story, which is we as a global community pay a lot of attention to the exclamation point moments for persecuted populations when there's a genocide happening, a mass displacement, something horrible. And we rightfully should pay attention to those exclamation point crises. But it's also really important to pay attention to the slow squeeze. And that's that discrimination that you were just talking about. The way the Iraqi constitution was drafted after the U.S. invasion of Iraq does acknowledge the right of religious minorities to live in Iraq and exist in Iraq, but it does also establish Islam as the religion of Iraq. And with that comes all sorts of practicalities about how Christians are identified, rules about the kids of mixed marriages, or in some cases, children of rape across religious lines that are sort of a function or an expression of that government and its conception. And then there are all of these de facto aspects of life on the ground for Christians, things that actually are so normal to this population that people talked about them as though they were just, like the weather. The fact that, for example, in Bartella, a town down the street from Cromlech in the Nineveh Plain, which was historically Christian, has now demographically essentially inverted so that Christians no longer have that strong majority population. They can't get hired by non-Christian businesses. There's this real tension on the streets between Christians and non-Christians. This sense that the lived atmosphere where there are sort of political signs around from groups that have as part of their slogans the elimination of or the downplaying of Christian influence in the region. The Christians see this as an implicit or I guess explicit threat. And this is just part of their everyday life, this sense that groups of different religious identity have to be separate, that they're not going to be treated in the same way, and that Christians essentially think they have to fend for themselves, especially in the absence of a stable functioning government that is committed to their protection and security.
And as you point out in the piece, this is not just a story about the persecution of a minority religion. It's a story almost of democracy in Iraq and the failure of democracy, which, said these societies can be measured by their tolerance of religious minorities, by how much pluralism is a societal value, and the persecution of a religious minority, in this case Christian, augurs poorly for the health and the strength of that sort of young and fledgling democracy.
That's exactly right. I think the case of religious persecution of Christians in Iraq specifically captivated me and stuck with me in part because I would say it's a canary in the coal mine, but actually we're past that point. There's an inflection point really and truly about whether Christianity will survive in any meaningful way in Iraq and certainly in other places in the region as well. And this is sad in part because of history and culture and all of those things, but it's sad largely and tragic largely because it is a test of just how thoroughly the ideals of a democratic Middle East have not been able to be put into place. And I do think that, and lots of scholarship shows that, the inability of countries to sustain diversity, to allow a series of religious minorities to thrive alongside a majoritarian population is, in fact, a test of its cultural and political health and will to sustain this commitment to sort of difference and governance through coming together in a public square despite your identity. So I do think that the story of the Christians in the Middle East is big historically, but also huge politically for our understanding of what's going to come next in these countries that are essentially squeezing out all of their historic religious minority populations.
And the Nineveh Valley also has some like geopolitical explanatory power as well. I mean, as you say, Pence, Vice President Pence, is sort of leading this charge in the U.S. government to try to pour more resources into the Nineveh Valley to help rebuild Christian communities there and support Christian communities there. There's also, rumors or evidence perhaps that Iran is also seeking a foothold in this area as a way to broaden its influence in Iraq. Can you talk, I suppose, a little bit just about the sort of geopolitical relevance of that piece of territory and how that sort of fits into, your broader story?
Yeah. If you imagine on a map this swath of territory in the northern region of Iraq and just look at what it has for its neighbors, so to speak, you can immediately see that it is in a very hot neighborhood of the world. So there's Iran to the east, which a lot of scholars, people in the government, people on the ground believe Iran wants to establish a corridor of influence that reaches from Iran through Iraq into Syria. And obviously, Iran has been trying to exercise more control over Iraq for basically all of time, but especially in recent years has been more successful in asserting its control there. So that's sort of the neighbor to the east. To the west, you have Syria and the instability that's there. It was obviously home to the last pockets of ISIS until very recently. To the north, you have the Kurdish independence region, and that is a sort of harbinger of instability insofar as to the south, you have Baghdad, and the conflict between those two entities has also been very complicated for the Christians. A story that I'll tell is a family that I met who were displaced from their house after ISIS came and then tried to go back. They wanted to go back to their town, but they had to leave again because the front line of the conflict between Iraqi security forces and Kurdish security forces ran through their town. So that conflict heated up in the couple of years right after ISIS. And so they were displaced once again by internal Iraqi politics. So they have been basically caught on all sides. And when the U.S. looks at this, when the Trump administration looks at this, they see not only a country that we have had a long involvement with that they want to retain as an ally against Iran, but they also see this swath of territory that we have had a large military presence in that they do not want to see falling to American enemies. And one of the theories that I offer in the piece based on interviews that I did with Trump administration officials is that there's this very clear dotted line between this sense that the U.S. has an obligation to stabilize religious minorities in Iraq because of our commitment to religious freedom, and our sense that the stability of these populations is a bulwark against the rise of extremist forces, either in terms of insurgent forces, but also in terms of regimes that the United States perceives to be its enemies.
So finally, in the piece, and you just said in our conversation that since, the last 2 decades, there's been an 80% decline in the Christian population in Iraq to now about 250,000 people. What sort of events might suggest to you that that number would precipitously fall even further and, Christians in Iraq will go sort of the same way the Jews in Iraq did in the 40s and 50s, and where there were, a decent sizable Jewish population there, but now there's virtually none?
So a few things. The first is that with that comparison to the Jews in particular, I was actually shocked by how many of the priests I met brought that up without any prompting. I was interested in that history and that connection, and it was something I was wanting to explore anyways, but unprompted, very often they would bring up this sense that once there were Jews in Iraq and they disappeared, and now Christians are the next people on that list of ancient peoples from Iraq who will no longer be there. They see what's happening around them. So their own self-conception, at least on certain days in certain communities, is very much one of pessimism. But I would say the most powerful testament to me was meeting family after family after family. And these are people who have either had the bad luck of not being able to emigrate despite their efforts to emigrate. They don't have the right connections or ability to secure visas or the money. Or these are people who have tried to stay and want to stay, but nonetheless, uniformly across the board, everyone I spoke with acknowledged that they either were trying to leave, would leave, or potentially might get to a point one day where it might be necessary for them to leave. I remember, for example, a family I met. I went and sat in their living room, and we were talking about, this was actually the family that had been displaced twice, once by ISIS and once by the conflict between Baghdad and Erbil. And they were talking about their town and their house and their family. And the patriarch of the family said, "We would never leave. You know, you'd have to cut me to my bone before I will leave. Like I will never go. This is our homeland." And then I said, and then maybe 10 minutes later, I said something like, you know, what if somebody offered you visas to go to the United States, you know, in a year or two? He said, yes, hands down. If you can guarantee me that we wouldn't be stuck in Jordan or Turkey, that we would get to go to the US or Australia or Europe in 1 or 2 years, I would take my entire family tomorrow. So there's really, even among the people who want to stay, this sense that it is an unstable situation. Security is not guaranteed. The future is very cloudy. The more people who leave, the harder it is to stay. And I don't think this is the end of Christianity in the Middle East. And I don't think the story has been written to its conclusion. I think there's absolutely a possibility that something will turn, the stabilization efforts will work, that there could be some form of hope. But I do think that all of these factors make it very, very hard to imagine a sustainable future where people can build a life for themselves after all of the instability they've been through.
Well, Emma, thank you so much for your time. And thank you so much for the piece. I'll post a link to it on the website.
I appreciate your time and willingness to talk about this topic.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Emma Green. That was a great interview. I love that article. Go check it out in The Atlantic. And as I said at the outset, please do support the show, be becoming a premium subscriber. These bonus episodes are great. There are about 50 of them that I'll be rolling out that are my very favorite interviews from the archives with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers who just tell great stories, have great life and career advice, and it's almost like an oral history of key events as well in foreign policy. So become a premium subscriber. Also, here's a little pop quiz. In the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, what is the key figure that you know of who is from Nineveh? Let me know. Send me an email. I will see you later. Bye.